How many of you saw television in the 1950s or 60s? Quite a few of us have. Many of us weren't even born at that time. So please, bear with us during this history lesson. But during the 1950s and the 60s, we sat around sometimes this black tube and sometimes this huge box that had this very small screen in it. And we really strained to see what was going on the other side. But many times there were programs that had to do with the family. We saw that families were supposed to get together and they were supposed to have a meal around a table. We saw that families were perfect. We saw Ozzie and Harriet out there. We saw Father Knows Best. We saw all of these different programs. And when we saw all of these different programs, by the time that the mid-1960s came, people began to reject the idea of Ozzie and Harriet. They began to reject the idea of Father Knows Best, because how is it that a father could ever know best? And how is it that Ozzie and Harriet never really seemed to disagree about something? And so there was birthed during that time in the 1960s the entire idea that there were things in family that you just never spoke about. One of the things that you never spoke about was you never spoke about politics. In family, you never spoke about politics. That's what you just don't do. You don't talk about politics. You don't talk about the way the country's going. The country will come and it'll go, and it's just going to go on, and things are just going to be whatever they've always been, and you never need to get involved or think about it. They never talked about religion. I mean, you know, really, if our children really wanted to choose Jesus, I'm going to let them choose whatever religion that they want to choose. Well, look what we got. Well, we're not going to talk about sex either. That's what we're not going to do. We're not going to talk about sex. We don't talk about sex around here in the family. We don't really talk about those kinds of things. And the thing that they never talked about more than anything else was, in a family, they never talked about money. Because money was the reason why 90% of divorces were occurring, and so they never spoke about money. But let's say that you grew up in a home where what it was that you had your parents that sat you down, and what they told you that you needed to do was that you needed to make sure that you set up a great retirement account for yourself. They made sure that you lived debt-free. They told you, now what you need to do is you always need to live debt-free. You need to have a retirement account. You always need to have an emergency fund. You have to have in this emergency fund. And oh, by the way, you need to right away start saving for your children's college. You need to make sure that you start saving for college. And oh, by the way, don't forget to pay your house off early. But even if it were true that what happened was that you actually lived debt-free, if what you did was that you had an emergency fund, if what you did was you actually had a great account for your retirement, you had your college paid for your kids, and what you did was you paid your house off early, you were still missing the most important thing about your finances, and that was giving. Because it's a far cry in between being a person who hears what God has to say and who does what God has to say. Now somebody's saying, well, now, what's so really important about all of this? Why in the world do we talk about these kinds of things? You know, what God's got to say about generosity and about money. Why do we talk about that? And the reason why is simply this, because that's where you're going. How many of you have noticed that no matter what seems to happen, no matter how much you don't really want it to, that today you're a day older than you were yesterday? Even Chelsea understands that yesterday she was 29. But I told her this morning, I said, sweetie, I said, you'll never pass this way again. It's really true. So there's a far cry in between doing the word and hearing what it says. So what I wanted to do is I actually put together 5 different stories of 5 different givers that I thought would encourage us to be the greatest givers that we could be. The first one was about a man who gave God 90%. How many of you have ever heard the name R.G. Letourneau? You've heard the name R.G. Letourneau. R.G. Letourneau was a Christian industrialist. Now, what you need to know about R.G. Letourneau is that R.G. Letourneau, he grew up in a Christian home. His parents really were not of any type of notoriety whatsoever, but R.G. Letourneau actually refused to be a Christian until the age of 16. He refused it. He didn't want anything to do with this God that his parents had served. But at the age of 16, he became a Christian, and he said these words, and everyone knew that he had said them. He said, I am going to be a Christian businessman because God needs businessmen as much as he needs pastors. No truer words were ever spoken. God needs businessmen. He needs people to prosper as much as he needs people to go out and preach the gospel. Because without it, you'll never be able to touch the world. You know, while I was looking up R.G. Letourneau, and he was actually in a file, what is called Giants for God. And on this page of Giants for God, R.G. Letourneau was there, but the next person that was on those pages was Peter J. Daniels as a giant for God. Norman Vincent Peale, it gave a quote of Norman Vincent Peale and how that Norman Vincent Peale said concerning Peter J. Daniels that he was the greatest Christian businessman speaker that he'd ever heard in his entire life. Peter J. Daniels, someone who is related to you. You see, honestly, R.G. Letourneau was a man that actually turned his life around. He said, like Peter Daniels, because Peter Daniels said that before the age of 85, which will be in 1 more year, he said that he wanted to know how much one man could give by the age of 85. R.G. Letourneau actually turned his life from a place where what he did was, having known that he needed to tithe when he first came to Christ, he went from that place to where he gave 90% of his income and lived on 10. He had over 300 patents. Over 70% of all of the earth-moving equipment used in the Second World War was actually invented by R.G. Letourneau. R.G. Letourneau actually was looking for a place that what he could do was that he could begin to train people, and there was a 154-acre hospital that was used for the VA in Texas that was about to be torn down, and R.G. Letourneau purchased it in order to be able to make the Letourneau University for training leaders for our world. R.G. Letourneau, the man who gave 90% of his income to God. How many of you would like to see how much money God could give you so that you could give it away? Isn't that true? I'm raising my hand for that one. Now, I have a gentle encouragement for you. Take a look at this. Here's my gentle encouragement for number 1. My gentle encouragement is this. Whatever percentage of your income you're currently giving, make a lifelong plan to bump that percentage by believing God to become more so you can give more. Say, God, I want to become more so that I can give more. You know, we have to make sure that we never fall into the trap of staying the way that we all already are. Number 2, the second story that I want to tell you about is about the woman or the widow who impressed Jesus. Can you imagine that there was a poor widow who impressed Jesus? Impressing Jesus isn't real easy, is it? But there was this widow, in Mark chapter 12, beginning with verse number 41. Take a look. It says, "Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury." Everyone say, Jesus watched to see how people put in money into God's treasury. He said, "But then the poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans," whatever that means. "So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, assuredly," he said, "I'm telling you something." He said that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. Verse 44. "For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her want. She put it in out of her want. All that she had, she put in all of her livelihood." You see, there are things about Jesus that can be impressed. Jesus is impressed by giving. He's impressed by you. He's impressed by me when what we do is that we choose to put Him and the needs of the people that He has put in our paths before ourselves. Here's our gentle encouragement for number 2. It's consider increasing your giving, whether your money, whether your time, or whether your talents, before convenience or beyond convenience into the place of sacrifice. Say, beyond convenience, into sacrifice. Say, beyond convenience, into sacrifice. We must come to the place where in our lives we are ready to sacrifice. Because this next story that I want to give you is a story that many of us may not understand. But it was of the priest of Auschwitz. This priest of Auschwitz, who was named Malcolm Kolbe, really was an individual who the Nazis were having a very, very difficult time with, because they knew that what he was doing was that he was hiding Jews during the Second World War. So no matter what, this Catholic priest, he was hiding these people, and one day they found that there were 3 more prisoners that went up missing. And when they found that there were 3 more prisoners that went up missing because he was hiding them in order to be able to smuggle them out of the concentration camp of Auschwitz, what happened was that the Nazi, we'll just say the people that were handling or managing or wardening Auschwitz, they decided that what they were going to do was that they were actually going to starve to death 10 people until all of this stopped. So every time that 10 would die, they would actually put 10 more in a place where what they would do is that they would starve to death in front of people. And so what happened was when they put the first 10 in the starvation, what they called the starvation cell, there was one of the men whose name was Francis, of a Polish name that I can't even pronounce, as I tried for 2 days. So these people that were in there, and Francis actually began to cry. And he began to cry out and he said, "My wife, my children, my kids, what am I going to do? If I'm put in this cell," he died anyway. He said, "But if I'm put in this cell, what am I about to do?" And right at that particular point, Malcolm actually said to his captors, or the ones that captured him, he said this. He said, "I am old, and he is young. Let me take his place in death, so his family won't have to give him up." And much to everyone's surprise, the Nazi captors actually accepted Malcolm instead of Francis. And when they did for 2 weeks inside of those starvation cells, Malcolm actually was leading the rest of the people in the cells in hymns and spiritual reading, and they were having church every day, and Malcolm led church. And after 2 weeks, there's only one person still alive, and that was Malcolm. They couldn't kill him. And what they did was they actually took Malcolm, and in front of everyone, they were going to give him, or actually did give him, a lethal injection to be able to kill Malcolm. And Malcolm actually submitted to that lethal injection by raising his left hand. And still having church, everyone saw that Malcolm willingly gave his life for someone else. Jesus said in John 15:13, he said, "Greater love has no man than this, but that he would lay down his life for his friend." You see, when we talk about giving, many times we don't talk about it from this perspective. Here's our gentle encouragement for number 3. Please keep in mind, just keep in mind about how you may serve others. It may not be the way that you think. Your giving may never be the way that you think that it is. It must never be, friends. Avoid self-imposed limitations, because God may have a bigger life for you. Number 4. Number 4 is actually the pastor, his act of kindness. In New Orleans, there was a pastor that was in New Orleans that actually went to a convenience store and saw that there was a family that was standing in front of him. And what they were about to do is they were about to buy some bread and buy some things for their family. But he could see very quickly that they were disappointed over the fact that they didn't have all the money that they needed to be able to purchase those things while they stood in line. And so the pastor said into the man's ear, he said, "Don't be concerned. Take this money and pay for the food that your family needs." 9 years later, he was speaking at a church in New Orleans, having just traveled there from somewhere else. And a man came up to him after he was done and told him a story. He said, 9 years ago, you did something for me. He said, "How did you know?" He said, "I'll never forget your voice." He said, "What you don't know is that that day was that things were so bad for me and for my family that we made a suicide pact. But what we wanted to do before we went out and committed suicide, even our children had agreed to do so. Before we were about to commit suicide, I promised them to have one more meal. But when I went to buy that meal, I didn't have enough money to pay for it. So that day when you gave me this money, we did eat that meal, and we did also go out to the place that we all had decided to commit suicide together at. And we wept for hours. We wept for hours. And we couldn't commit suicide. And after we left there, he said, while we were on our way home, we drove past the church. And on the sign it said, "Jesus loves you." He said, and that next Sunday, my wife and I went to that church. And it was on that day that the both of us had gotten saved 9 years ago. And it was you. So don't ever think, friends, and this is what he told him. He said, don't think that what you did was you gave me a meal. He said, you saved my life that day. And the fifth story, well, here's our general encouragement. Always maintain your spiritual antenna, because God may use the smallest gift you ever give to save someone's life. But probably the greatest story of all was the story, number 5, of the father who gave his most precious possession. There was a set of parents, much like you and I, but there was a father who had a house, and he had children really that he loved, many, many children that he loved, but he loved them, but sadly, they didn't love him back. I know that I'm speaking to many of you that have had children that didn't love you back. Children that you loved and cared for. But what happened was that this father had an idea, because he had one son, and this one son was one that listened to him, loved him, obeyed him. He was just everything to this father. And the father said, I know what I'll do. He said, maybe, just maybe, if I sacrificed my one son, then all of the rest of my children can come home to me. And all of us know that that story is not the story that could be left out, because it's the greatest story of all. Because it was actually the story that God gave Jesus to be able to have you and I come home. In John chapter 3, verse number 16, the Bible tells us, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but that he would have everlasting life. Sadly, I can tell you this, that it's so true, so true. That people reduce everything about a relationship with God. They reduce it down to methods and things that they do. But more than anything else, it's not about what you do. It's about where your heart is. It's how hard you've become, or how soft you allow yourself to be. Anything that happens between you and someone else, you can get over. Anything that happens between you and God, he can get over. But you know what he can't get over? He can't get over when you won't admit that something happened. The same as a husband can't get over it. The same as a wife can't get over it. The same as a mother or a father or a friend can't get over it when it's never admitted. You see, everyone has motivations to give. Everyone has motivation to give. If you don't know Jesus, if you have never, ever, ever started your walk with God to where what you did was you wanted to follow him, today's your day to follow him. to make a decision that you're not the king of your own heart and life anymore, but that He is. I've never ever wanted to control you or manipulate you into walking with Jesus, ever. I never have. But all I can tell you is this. The Father's motivation to give Jesus was for you. Now He wants us to have a motivation to give so that others may live. So my question to you today is, what's your motivation? Take a look at this.